Jim Reynolds stood at the edge of the street, watching the world pass by, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn-out jacket. The noise of the city, a constant hum of rushing traffic, and the distant shouts of street vendors felt like it was muffled in his ears. It was strange, this feeling, standing in the middle of the city he owned, yet feeling like an outsider. He had everything a man could want: wealth, power, status. But somehow, it wasn't enough. Not anymore. His thoughts drifted back to the days when he had a family, when he had a reason to wake up every day with purpose. That was before the accident. His wife and child had died, and with them, any real connection to life. The endless meetings, the boardrooms, the applause for another successful deal. None of it filled the void. It only amplified it. Today was different. Today, Jim Reynolds was not the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech empire. Today, he was someone else, someone invisible. He pulled the cap lower on his head, adjusting the disguise that felt foreign to him. A faded street sweeper uniform, scuffed boots, and gloves stained with dirt. To anyone else, he was just another faceless worker, unnoticed by the busy world around him. He blended into the background of the city like a ghost, and it felt freeing. The weight of his identity as a millionaire, the expectations, the constant pressure, he could forget about all that. He was just a man doing a job, as ordinary as anyone else. The sound of a nearby bus horn pulled him back to reality. A group of people walked by, oblivious to his presence, rushing through their busy lives, each person locked in their own world. Jim found himself staring at their faces, wondering how many of them had ever really thought about the lives of the people who kept this city running. People like him, people who were ignored, invisible, and yet essential. He wiped his brow with his sleeve, a mix of sweat and dirt staining the fabric. His back ached from the weight of the broom, the physicality of the job unfamiliar and uncomfortable. But Jim pressed on, determined to see it through. There was something in this moment, something about the simplicity of the task that he needed, something that reminded him of who he used to be before his life had become a series of calculated moves and empty victories. It wasn't until he rounded a corner that he noticed her. Elena. She was sweeping the sidewalk, moving with practiced ease as if the task had been ingrained in her body for years. Her face was set in a grim expression, but there was a quiet strength in the way she worked, a resilience that struck Jim. She looked like someone who had seen more hardship than most, but kept going, never showing any sign of breaking. He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, the urge to speak to her overwhelming. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she reminded him of something he had lost, an appreciation for the simpler things, for hard work, for living with purpose. Or maybe it was the way she carried herself, as if she belonged in this world and yet didn't at the same time. As he got closer, she glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before quickly darting away. Jim felt a pang of discomfort, a reminder of how out of place he really was in this role. He cleared his throat. "Need help?" he asked, his voice awkward, rough from disuse. She looked at him again, skeptical, her lips pressed together in a thin line, and for a moment, Jim wondered if she would just walk away. But she didn't. Instead, she gave him a once-over and shrugged. "You look like you could use some help, but I doubt you're cut out for this," she said, her tone flat but not unkind. Jim laughed, the sound coming out more like a grunt. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I'm trying." Elena watched him for a moment, sizing him up, as if trying to figure out why someone like him would choose to take on this job, of all things. She said nothing for a long beat before finally speaking again. "Well, keep at it," she said, turning back to her work. "It's harder than it looks." Jim nodded, watching her for a moment longer before picking up his broom and joining her. There was something magnetic about her, something real, something that made him feel like he could breathe again, like he could leave behind the life he had built for the one he had been running from. For the first time in years, Jim Reynolds felt like he had a purpose again, not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as someone who could make a difference, even if it was just in this small, unremarkable corner of the world. Jim watched Elena work from the corner of his eye. She moved with a fluid grace, every sweep of the broom purposeful, as if it was second nature to her. Her back was straight, her shoulders slightly hunched from years of hard labor. But there was a quiet strength in her that caught Jim off guard. He had been in many boardrooms, seen many powerful figures, but none of them had this quiet, unwavering resolve. He couldn't help but study her. She was everything he used to admire, authentic, no pretense. Unlike the polished professionals he dealt with every day, Elena was real. She had no facade, just her raw determination and focus. And yet, as Jim stood there invisible in his new identity, something about her stirred an unfamiliar ache inside him. She reminded him of what he had lost long ago, something money couldn't replace. He took a few hesitant steps toward her. The street was quieter now, the hum of the city fading in the background as he approached. He adjusted the cap he wore, pulling it lower, hoping to blend in even more. The last thing he wanted was for her to recognize him. Not like this. Not yet. "Need some help?" Jim asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice felt foreign to him, rough and unsure. Elena didn't immediately respond. She paused for a moment, her hands still on the broom, her gaze flicking up to meet his. There was a long beat before she spoke, her voice measured, almost indifferent. "Why? You think you can do this?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, her lips barely twitching. Jim smiled awkwardly, trying to mask the uncertainty bubbling inside him. "I've never done it before," he said, "but I'm sure I can give it a shot." Elena studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to laugh or walk away. Jim held his breath. He didn't expect her to just take him at face value. He hadn't earned that yet. But he did feel the weight of her scrutiny, the silent judgment that he couldn't escape. Finally, she shrugged, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Well, it's harder than it looks." "Yeah," Jim replied, his voice trailing off. He picked up the broom beside him, fumbling slightly with it, before falling into rhythm next to her. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of the broom sweeping against the pavement the only noise between them. Jim found the motion strangely soothing. It was physical work, simple and repetitive, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something resembling peace. No meetings, no high-pressure decisions, just this, the simple act of cleaning the streets. As he worked, he couldn't help but glance over at Elena every so often. She didn't speak much, her movements deliberate and precise, but Jim couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than just the surface. The way her jaw clenched when she saw a piece of trash left behind, how she seemed to take pride in every inch of the street she worked on. She wasn't just doing a job, she was fighting for something, though Jim wasn't sure what yet. After a few minutes, Elena finally spoke again, breaking the silence between them. "So, what's your story?" Jim froze for a second, caught off guard. "My story?" he repeated, unsure of how to respond. "You don't look like you belong here," she said bluntly, glancing at him. "I mean, what kind of guy decides to clean the streets?" Jim could feel the weight of her words settling on him. She was right. There was no logical reason for him to be here. But he had to answer her, had to say something that would make sense, even if it didn't make sense to him. "I just wanted to see it from this side," Jim said, his voice quieter now, "to experience what it's really like for people who do this every day." Elena didn't respond right away. She just nodded as though she understood something about him that he hadn't fully realized himself. She didn't ask any more questions, which Jim was grateful for. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to hide behind the facade of wealth and status. He could just be. And it felt oddly freeing. They continued working in silence, but this time Jim felt different, more connected perhaps than he had in years. Elena's presence, though silent, filled a void inside him. She was everything he had been missing, an authentic, unpretentious person doing hard work with pride, despite the odds stacked against her. When they finally finished, Elena stood up, brushing the dust from her hands. She glanced at him one more time, her expression unreadable. "Well, you did okay," she said, her voice warmer now, even a hint of respect in her tone. "You might actually make it as a street sweeper after all." Jim smiled, feeling a genuine sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long time, It was enough. The sun had dipped low in the sky when Jim and Elena finished sweeping the street. It was one of those rare, quiet moments where the city felt like it was holding its breath. The sounds of traffic and chatter had softened into a distant hum. Elena stood still for a moment, wiping her hands on her uniform, her gaze drifting across the street. Jim watched her, unsure of how to break the silence. They hadn't talked much in the last hour. Their actions spoke louder than words, the broom strokes marking time in the calm of the evening. Still, there was a distance between them that Jim couldn't ignore. Something was there, something unspoken, an invisible barrier he couldn't cross, and it made him uneasy. Elena shifted her weight, her eyes meeting his. "You don't talk much for someone who's used to being in charge." Jim blinked, taken aback by her directness. He had expected small talk, maybe a joke to ease the tension, but not this. The truth laid bare, as if she could see right through him. He smiled awkwardly, scratching his neck. "I guess I'm just not used to this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the street, at the broom in his hands. "Being around people who don't know me or what I do, it's different." She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Different doesn't mean bad." Jim shifted his weight, looking at her but finding it hard to meet her eyes. The truth was, he didn't know how to talk to her. He wasn't used to real conversations anymore. Everything he did, every word he said felt scripted, calculated. But Elena, she had a raw honesty that was impossible to ignore. "I'm not used to being invisible," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Elena didn't respond immediately, but the silence between them felt less strained now. She didn't look at him with judgment, just curiosity. He could tell that, in her eyes, he was just another person, not some wealthy businessman trying to impress her. That made him feel lighter somehow, more human. "Life doesn't work that way for most people," she said softly, her voice a little distant. "You might think you're invisible, but I see people like you every day. They walk past me. They don't care about the work I do. But that's the way it is. People don't look too hard unless they have to, and when they do, it's never for the right reasons." Her words stung, though Jim couldn't explain why. They weren't accusatory, but they held a truth he hadn't wanted to face. He had spent his life building walls around himself, around his grief, around his guilt. It was easier to let people look past him than to let them see who he truly was. But with Elena, it was different. There was no wall, no mask, and that terrified him. He shifted uncomfortably, looking away. He wasn't ready to tell her his story, not yet. But something about her made him want to. He wanted her to understand, to see him for who he was, not just the millionaire behind the polished suits. "I didn't always live like this," he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I used to have a family, a life that mattered, and I lost it." Elena didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there as though weighing his words before speaking again. "I didn't have much growing up," she said, her voice steady. "No mom, no dad, just me and my little brother. We made it work. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder if things would get better, if life would offer us anything more than struggle. But here we are, still fighting." Jim's heart tightened as he listened, a mix of sorrow and admiration washing over him. He had no idea what it was like to grow up like that, to face the world with nothing but sheer will and hope that things might someday change. "Why are you telling me this?" Jim asked, his voice hushed, almost pleading. He didn't want to dig deeper, didn't want to know what else she'd been through, what else she might have lost. But part of him was desperate to understand. Elena glanced up at him, her expression hardening just a bit. Because maybe for once someone should listen. Jim stood silently for a moment, digesting her words. She was right, of course. He had spent his entire life talking, but rarely listening. Now, in the quiet between them, he realized how much he had missed by shutting people out. How much pain, how much loneliness had accumulated because he had never truly opened up to anyone. Her words cut deeper than he expected, but they weren't meant to wound. They were simply a reminder of the way life could break you, reshape you, and still leave you standing somehow. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't ready for this, wasn't ready to peel back the layers of his life, his grief, his guilt. Not yet. Not when he wasn't sure who he was anymore. "Maybe someday," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Maybe someday I'll tell you." Elena didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The silence between them now felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable or awkward anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are finally on the same page, understanding each other without the need for words. And for the first time in a long while, Jim felt like he could breathe. It was just another afternoon in the neighborhood, the streets buzzing with the usual energy. Jim and Elena had spent hours sweeping the sidewalk, moving methodically down the street. The work was harder than he anticipated, but Jim found that it wasn't the physical strain that was exhausting. It was the emotional weight of it all. He had been hiding in plain sight for days, silently observing the lives of those around him. Each day, Elena was there, always with the same focused determination. Yet today, something felt different. The weight of her gaze lingered on him a little longer than usual, as though she saw something in him that he wasn't quite ready to face. He had tried his best to keep his distance, but it was getting harder. He felt drawn to her. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, a noise broke through the stillness, a screeching tire, followed by a dull thud. Jim snapped his head toward the sound. It was just down the street. He saw a man stumbling to his feet, clutching his chest, a deep red stain already spreading across his shirt. He was lying on the pavement, struggling for breath. Without thinking, Jim rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Elena!" he shouted. But the words barely made it past his lips. She was already running toward him, her eyes wide with alarm. As Jim approached the man, he realized that the situation was worse than he thought. Blood was pouring from a wound near his side, and the man's breath came in short, ragged bursts. He was in pain, clearly panicking. "What happened?" Elena shouted, kneeling beside the man. The man's eyes flickered open, filled with confusion. "I didn't mean to. I didn't—" "Don't talk," Jim said, trying to steady the man. "We need to get you help." Elena quickly took charge, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Call an ambulance!" she shouted at a passerby. The stranger hesitated for a moment, but as Elena locked eyes with him, he nodded and rushed off to call for help. Jim kneeled beside the injured man, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to apply pressure to the wound. The man's breathing was shallow and his face twisted in pain. Jim could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the reality of what was happening hitting him full force. His mind raced. What if they couldn't get help in time? What if this man died here, in the street, because they couldn't act fast enough? As Jim looked over at Elena, he saw something in her eyes that he couldn't place. It was a look of understanding, of deep empathy. She hadn't hesitated when she saw the man hurt. She hadn't flinched at the sight of blood, hadn't been paralyzed by fear. She had simply acted. "Elena," Jim said, his voice rough, "how do you stay so calm?" She glanced up at him, her face set in determination. "You don't have a choice. You do what you have to." Jim swallowed hard. Her words pierced through him. They were so simple, but so true. He had spent years running from his emotions, from the things that truly mattered. Yet here was Elena, a woman who had seen real hardship, who had experienced things he couldn't even begin to imagine, and she was more composed than he could ever hope to be. She wasn't afraid to act, to feel, to be human. Jim's heart clenched as the ambulance finally arrived. Paramedics rushed out, and within moments the injured man was being loaded into the back of the ambulance. Elena watched the scene with quiet resolve, but Jim could see the exhaustion in her posture. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there beside her, silently offering whatever support he could. "You did well," he said softly, trying to break the silence. I wouldn't have known what to do without you." Elena didn't immediately respond. She just nodded, her eyes focused on the ambulance as it pulled away. Finally, she turned to Jim, her expression unreadable. "I'm not a hero, Jim. I'm just someone trying to survive." She paused, and for a moment, Jim thought she might say something more, but she didn't. She simply walked away, back to the street, back to her work. Jim stood there watching her retreating figure, a sense of unease washing over him. He had come to this place to experience life in the simplest form, to learn what it truly meant to live without the shield of wealth and status. But now, standing in the silence of the street, he couldn't help but feel like he was on the verge of something he wasn't ready to face. He wasn't just here to sweep the streets. He was here to face his past, to confront the truths he had been hiding from for so long. And Elena, with her strength, her unflinching honesty, had shown him just how far he still had to go. Detective Sam Cooper leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he sifted through the stack of files before him. He had been working the case for days now, and something about Jim Reynolds bothered him. The street sweeper who had shown up out of nowhere, the way he acted around Elena, it didn't sit right. Sam was no stranger to people hiding things, and Jim's facade seemed a little too perfect, too controlled. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind racing. There was something off about the whole situation. A millionaire-billionaire suddenly deciding to live the life of a street sweeper. A man used to power, suddenly submitting to the humbling work of a laborer in a neighborhood where no one even knew who he really was. It didn't add up. Sam had done his research. Jim Reynolds was the CEO of a tech company, one of the wealthiest men in the city, with more media appearances and charity events than most could count. He was always in the spotlight. But here, he was just another anonymous worker, moving with surprising grace but hiding behind a cheap uniform. Jim had become a ghost in the city he owned. As Sam examined the public information on Reynolds, a pattern began to form. Jim had a reputation for being cold, distant, calculating, a businessman who didn't make emotional connections. Yet here he was, acting as if he belonged among the working class, engaging with Elena, a woman who, by all appearances, had nothing. Sam frowned. What was Jim running from? Or more importantly, what was he hiding? He knew the answer wouldn't come easily, but something about this whole situation felt like a puzzle. And Sam's instincts told him it was only a matter of time before all the pieces fell into place. He set the file aside and turned to his phone, dialing the number of a local informant. The man on the other end answered after 2 rings, his voice thick with the street's grime. "Yeah? Did you find anything on Jim Reynolds?" Sam asked, his tone curt. There was a long pause, followed by a sigh. "You're not going to like this, Cooper. Reynolds, he's been spotted more than once around the South Side. He's been seen talking to locals, seen walking into businesses. But here's the kicker. Every time someone tries to ask him anything, he shuts them down, won't talk to anyone about who he really is." Sam's jaw tightened. That was the confirmation he needed. Jim Reynolds wasn't just hiding his wealth. He was hiding something else, something deeper. "Keep digging," Sam said, his voice low. "I want everything you can find on him. Every lead, every connection." "Got it, detective." Sam hung up the phone, rubbing the back of his neck. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to uncovering something bigger. Jim Reynolds was playing a dangerous game, and it was only a matter of time before his secrets caught up with him. The thought of Elena weighed on him now. He had seen the way she interacted with Jim. Subtle, but there was an undeniable pull between them. A connection, however unspoken. Sam couldn't ignore it. Elena was too close to the situation, too close to Reynolds. He needed to protect her, but he couldn't figure out if she was in danger because of her connection to Jim, or if Jim was just another pawn in a much larger game. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. Another message, this time from the precinct. The report on the injured man Jim had helped earlier that day had come through. Sam's eyes flicked to the screen, scanning the details. It seemed the man had been involved in a minor altercation in the area, but no one could quite piece together the full story. A coincidence? Or was Jim's intervention a sign of something more? Something that could unravel the truth about the man hiding behind the mask of an ordinary street sweeper. Sam stared at the phone, his mind swirling. One thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not when everything seemed so off. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. It was time to dig deeper. The truth was there, hidden beneath the surface, and Sam was going to find it no matter what. The morning air felt heavy as Jim and Elena worked side by side, neither of them speaking much. It had been a few days since the incident with the injured man, and while the physical tension of sweeping the streets hadn't changed, something between them had shifted. There was a new understanding now, a quiet acknowledgement of the emotional distance they had both carefully maintained. Jim could feel it, the way Elena's eyes occasionally flicked to him when she thought he wasn't looking. He had seen that same look in the eyes of those he worked with in his business, a mix of curiosity, judgment, and caution. She was trying to figure him out, just as he had been trying to figure her out. He could tell she was keeping her distance, but she wasn't rude. She didn't make it obvious, but there was something in the way she focused solely on her task, her hands steady and sure, her expression unreadable. Jim couldn't help but feel like he was walking a fine line, trying not to cross a boundary that he didn't even fully understand. "Why do you do this?" Elena's voice suddenly broke the silence. She wasn't looking at him when she spoke, but her question felt sharp, like an arrow fired from a distance. Jim paused, his broom still in hand. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. His reason for coming here, to this neighborhood dressed as a street sweeper, was more complicated than anything he could explain. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I guess I just wanted to see what it was like. To understand, maybe." Elena's brow furrowed slightly, and for the first time in days, she looked directly at him. "Understand what?" Her voice was skeptical, but there was something else there, something softer. Jim met her gaze, feeling a weight in his chest. This wasn't what he had planned. He didn't know what he was doing here, standing in front of her, half in disguise, with nothing but his confusion to offer. "You don't know me," he said, the words tumbling out. "I'm not like the people you work with. I never have been." He hesitated, unsure if he should say more. "I thought this would be different. That I could, I don't know, feel something real. I don't know what I'm looking for anymore, Elena." There was a long pause. Elena's expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes shifted. She didn't seem surprised by his words, and that made Jim wonder if she had seen people like him before. "You think you can just walk into someone's life and understand it," she said, her voice firm. "You don't get to choose when and where you get to be part of something. Not like that." Jim winced at her bluntness. She wasn't wrong. He had been hiding behind his wealth for years, pretending that it was enough to fill the space where love and real connections used to be, pretending that wealth could solve every problem. But the more he tried to convince himself it worked, the more he realized how empty it was. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said, his voice steady now. "I'm just trying to figure out what I've been missing." She was silent for a moment, and Jim could see the wheels turning in her mind. The tension between them felt like it could snap at any moment, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked down at the broom in her hand, her fingers tightening around the handle. "I get it," Elena said, her voice quieter now. "You're not the first person to think they can understand a life like mine just because they pick up a broom, but it doesn't work that way. It takes more than cleaning a street or doing a job you don't care about to truly see what this life is like." Jim looked at her, his chest tight. He understood now. She wasn't just talking about sweeping the streets, she was talking about everything. The struggles, the pain, the daily fight to survive. It wasn't something that could be solved by a change of clothes or a temporary role. But still, he couldn't help but feel something drawing him to her, something he couldn't put into words. "Then tell me," he said, almost pleading. "What's it really like? I want to understand. I don't want to keep pretending like I have all the answers." Elena met his gaze, and for a moment Jim saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a mix of wariness and maybe a little hope. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice softening just a little. Jim nodded, holding his breath. He wasn't sure what she would say, but he wanted to hear it. All of it. The truth. The parts he had been too afraid to face on his own. Elena studied him for a long moment before speaking, her voice low but steady. "It's exhausting, Jim. Every day you wake up wondering if today's the day you'll finally make it. wondering if today's the day your brother gets caught up in something bad again or if your mom's health will get worse. But you keep going, because that's all you can do. You keep going, because if you stop, you lose. You lose everything. Her words hit Jim like a punch to the gut. He couldn't imagine that kind of life, the kind where survival was a constant battle. He had never had to fight for anything like that. "I'm not asking for your sympathy," Elena continued, her voice steady now. "I just want you to understand. This life isn't something you can just step into and out of whenever you want. It's not a game." Jim nodded, his mind reeling. He wasn't sure what to say next, but for the first time in days, he felt like he had learned something that actually mattered. Elena didn't wait for him to respond. She just picked up her broom again, her movements steady and unbothered. Jim followed her, picking up his broom and continuing to work, but this time the weight of her words stayed with him. It was as if the distance between them had shrunk, just a little. He hadn't gained her trust. He wasn't sure if that would ever happen, but he felt a shift, a subtle understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to his journey than simply escaping his own life. And that realization, that uneasy alliance, would be the beginning of something neither of them expected. The evening sky had already begun to darken as Jim and Elena continued their work. The usual quiet had settled over the street, the sound of brooms scraping against pavement, the only music to their ears. It was another ordinary day, or so it seemed. But as Jim swept, something felt different, heavier than before. Elena, who had been working with her usual focus, suddenly stopped. She didn't turn to look at him, but Jim could feel her tension. It was as though a storm was brewing inside her, and he didn't know how to calm it. He paused, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Is everything okay?" Elena didn't respond right away. Her back was to him, and for a moment Jim thought she might brush him off as usual, keeping her distance. But then she spoke, her voice low and tight, barely audible over the hum of the city. "You're not just some guy, are you?" she asked, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You don't just show up out of nowhere and pretend like you're one of us." Jim froze. His heartbeat quickened. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. The moment when his disguise would no longer be enough. The moment when his carefully constructed facade would crumble. But that didn't make it any easier. "I'm not pretending," he said, his voice sounding more strained than he intended. "I came here because I wanted to understand." Elena turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she looked him over. There was something different in her gaze now, something sharper, something that told Jim she was no longer just going to let him play his little game. "Understand?" she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You think you can just walk into someone's life and understand it because you pick up a broom? Because you wear a uniform? You don't get to understand. Not like that." Jim swallowed, trying to steady his breath. "You don't know anything about me, Elena." "Oh, I know enough," she shot back, stepping closer. "You think I can't tell? The way you look at people like me, like we're invisible, like we don't matter. You don't get to pretend to be part of this world without consequences." Jim's chest tightened. Her words stung more than he expected, and the anger in her voice felt like a direct hit. He wasn't used to this, to being called out, to feeling like the walls he'd built around himself, his wealth, his power, weren't enough to shield him anymore. "I'm not..." He didn't know how to finish the sentence. He wasn't sure what to say. What words could explain what he had been trying to do? The truth felt like it was sitting on the edge of his tongue, but every time he reached for it, he hesitated. "Elena, Before he could continue, Elena took a step back, her expression hardening. "No, don't. You don't get to do this." She shook her head, her voice thick with something between frustration and sadness. "You're not some hero, Jim. You're just another rich guy trying to play at being one of us. But you can't. You don't get to." The words hit Jim like a punch. She was right, wasn't she? He had been running from his own life, trying to find something real by disguising himself, pretending to be part of a world he didn't belong to. But he hadn't expected her to see through him so quickly. And now the weight of her disappointment hung heavily in the air. "I never meant to hurt you," Jim said, his voice raw. Elena didn't answer immediately. She stared at him for a long time as if trying to read him, to understand him. But whatever softness she had once shown seemed to be gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall. "I know you didn't," she finally said, her voice quieter now. "But sometimes that's not enough." Jim watched her turn away, her back stiff, the distance between them growing with each step she took. He felt a cold emptiness settle deep in his chest. This wasn't how he had wanted things to go. This wasn't what he had imagined when he decided to step into her world, to understand what it meant to live like she did. But maybe, in a way, this was what he deserved. As Elena walked toward the corner of the street, Jim stayed rooted in place, his broom still in hand, his heart heavier than it had ever been. For the first time in years, Jim felt truly alone. The weight of his deception, the truth that had been buried for so long, was now exposed. And Elena had seen right through it. She had called him out, forced him to face the person he had been running from. And the worst part? He didn't know how to fix it. The day had started like any other. The steady rhythm of the brooms sweeping the street, the sound of footsteps, and the hum of life moving around them. Jim had been working alongside Elena for hours, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but familiar. Still, the unease from their last conversation lingered in his chest, an unspoken tension that neither of them had addressed. Jim was certain that Elena could feel it too, but she didn't mention it, preferring to focus on the work at hand. But today, that silence would be broken in a way neither of them had anticipated. "Jim!" Elena's voice cracked through the air, sharp and urgent. Jim snapped his head up. He saw her standing by the corner of the street, her eyes wide with panic. Without thinking, he rushed toward her, his heart racing, unsure of what was happening. As he neared, he saw the reason for her distress. A group of men had gathered, their voices raised in anger. One of them was pushing a shopping cart, the other two standing in the middle of the sidewalk, blocking the path. Elena stood a few feet away from them, her face taut with worry, as she glanced at the men and then back at Jim. Her body was tense, her posture defensive but clearly on edge. "What's going on?" Jim asked, his voice low but sharp. "They're causing trouble again," Elena said, her words clipped. "They've been harassing the people who live here, pushing their way around. And today, it's my turn, I guess." Jim looked at the men, their rough faces and unruly stances betraying a sense of hostility. He could feel the air thickening, the tension rising. They weren't just blocking the path. They were here for something more, something dangerous. "You need to go," one of the men said, his voice mocking as he stepped toward Elena, towering over her. "You don't belong here, sweetheart. This is our turf. Get lost." Jim's blood ran cold as he watched Elena, but she didn't back down. She held her ground, her fists clenching at her sides, her chin lifted in defiance. She wasn't scared, but Jim could see the hurt in her eyes, the fear she didn't want to show. Without thinking, Jim stepped forward, positioning himself between Elena and the men. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but something inside him snapped. "You need to leave," Jim said, his voice stronger than he felt. "Now." The man who had been speaking smirked, his eyes narrowing as he sized Jim up. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he sneered, stepping closer. Elena moved a step back, but Jim didn't let her. His heart pounded and adrenaline coursed through his veins. He had been playing at being someone he wasn't for too long, hiding behind a mask of wealth, pretending to understand a life he'd never lived. But now, standing between Elena and these men, he realized he couldn't just watch anymore. "I'm someone who's tired of watching people like you push others around," Jim said, his voice steady but firm. The men laughed, but the sound was hollow, unconvincing. They clearly didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect Jim. "Get out of the way," one of the men spat, shoving Jim with more force than necessary. Jim's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He took a step back but planted his feet firmly in the ground, refusing to back down. "Elena, go," Jim said, his voice a low command. He turned to the men. "I'm not letting you do this." For a moment the men hesitated, unsure whether to escalate the situation. But then one of them stepped forward and shoved Jim again, this time hard enough to make him stumble. That was the tipping point. Jim's instinct took over. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it with a strength he didn't realize he had, forcing him to the ground. The other men backed off, surprised by the force of Jim's reaction. Elena was still standing there, her eyes wide, but Jim didn't care. He couldn't let this go on anymore. Not after everything he had seen. Not after realizing the kind of man he had been. "Leave her alone!" Jim shouted, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The men backed away slowly, muttering under their breath as they retreated, their pride wounded but not enough to press further. As they disappeared into the distance, Elena's gaze softened. She stepped forward, her eyes filled with both gratitude and something more, something Jim couldn't quite place. "You didn't have to do that," Elena said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Jim looked at her, his chest still heaving from the adrenaline. "I couldn't just stand there." His voice was hoarse, raw with emotion. Elena didn't respond immediately, but Jim could see the change in her expression. There was something new in her eyes, something that felt like a fragile bridge beginning to form between them. "You've got your own battles," Elena said softly. "But sometimes you just have to fight back. Not for the glory, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do." Jim nodded, though the weight of her words hit him harder than he had expected. This wasn't just about helping her, about stepping into her world for a day. This was about understanding the struggle, the fight, the strength it took to survive every single day in a world that didn't care. And for the first time, Jim felt like he was starting to understand. Jim stood by the side of the street, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. His confrontation with the men had left him more shaken than he expected. His body had acted without thought, but his mind couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over. He had never felt so exposed, so raw, but also so alive. Elena was standing just a few feet away, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. He could tell she was waiting for something, waiting for him to speak, to explain himself. But words failed him. He had never been good at this, at being real, at opening up in a way that didn't feel like a lie. For the first time since he arrived in this neighborhood, Jim felt like he was standing at the edge of something far deeper than he had intended. The surface had cracked, and beneath it, everything he had built, his wealth, his status, seemed almost irrelevant. This was about something else, about who he really was. "Why did you do it?" Elena's voice cut through the silence. It wasn't accusatory, but there was a hint of disbelief in her tone, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the man in front of her with the actions that had just unfolded. Jim turned to face her, his chest tight. He hadn't expected this. He had thought that by helping her, by standing up for her, he could begin to bridge the distance that had grown between them, the silence they had both avoided. But now, it felt like the moment of truth had come, like Elena was ready to see through him, to see the parts of him that he had been running from. Because I couldn't stand by and watch you face them alone," Jim said, his voice quieter now. The weight of the words settled heavily on his shoulders. "I don't know why it took me so long to realize that, but I couldn't just let them walk over you." Elena looked at him, her expression softening just slightly, but there was still something guarded in her eyes. She took a step closer, her voice steady. "That's not what I'm asking, Jim. Why are you really here? What are you trying to prove by pretending to be someone you're not?" Jim's heart skipped a beat. The question hung in the air, unspoken for so long, and now it was finally out. He had expected this moment, the moment when Elena would finally force him to face the truth. But hearing it aloud made it feel so much more real. He had been hiding behind his wealth, his reputation, wearing the mask of a street sweeper, thinking that if he could just blend in, he might understand what it meant to live a life that wasn't his. But now he wasn't sure how to explain it, how to put the feelings into words. "I'm not pretending, Elena," he said, his voice firm, though his insides twisted. "I'm trying to figure out who I am, what I've been running from." Elena's eyes searched his face as if she could see past the facade he had carefully constructed. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Jim could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she was seeing him, really seeing him, in a way that no one had in years. "You can't keep running, Jim," Elena finally said, her voice low but clear. "You can't keep hiding behind someone else's life. You have to face what you've been avoiding." The words hit Jim harder than he expected. He had been avoiding the truth for so long, keeping his distance from his own grief, his own mistakes. And now, in this moment, it felt like Elena was pushing him to confront everything he had buried deep inside. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am without all of this." He gestured toward the street sweeper uniform, the only part of him that felt real anymore. Without the mask. Elena's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jim thought she might offer comfort, some kind of reassurance. But she didn't. Instead, she just nodded, her expression understanding but not pitying. "You can start by being honest," she said, her voice quieter now. "Honest with yourself, honest with me." Jim swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost choking him. He wasn't sure how to be honest, how to strip away everything he had built and still hold on to some part of himself. But Elena was right. He had been running for far too long. As he stood there facing her, the realization hit him. He couldn't hide anymore. Not from her, not from himself. "I'm scared," he confessed, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Scared that if I face who I really am, I won't be able to live with myself. Scared that I'll lose everything, even the little I have left." Elena studied him for a long time, her gaze searching, understanding. Finally, she took a step closer, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to do it alone, Jim," she said softly. "You're not the only one with scars, but you have to face them. You can't run anymore." Jim felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a solution, and it wasn't an easy path, but for the first time he felt like he had the chance to move forward, to stop hiding. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words feeling strange but true. Elena gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, and for a moment, everything seemed possible. Detective Sam Cooper sat at his cluttered desk, his eyes scanning the files spread in front of him. He had been digging into Jim Reynolds for days now, trying to piece together the truth behind the man who had suddenly appeared in the heart of the neighborhood. Something wasn't right, and Sam's instincts told him there was more to Reynolds than met the eye. Sam had always prided himself on being able to read people, to understand their motivations and secrets just by watching their actions. And Reynolds? He didn't add up. He wasn't just hiding behind a fake identity as a street sweeper. He was hiding something deeper. Something that ran far beyond a simple act of charity or a temporary escape from his life of wealth and privilege. His informant had found something interesting earlier that day. It wasn't much, just a snippet of information, but it was enough to set off alarms in Sam's mind. Reynolds had been seen meeting with people from the neighborhood, local businesses, faces Sam didn't recognize, and each time, no one could get a straight answer out of him. No one could figure out who he was really meeting with or why he was there. Sam's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it, answering quickly. "Cooper, it's me," the informant's voice crackled through the line. "I got something you'll want to hear. A guy in the neighborhood, runs a pawn shop, knows people. He said he saw Reynolds leaving a warehouse a few days ago, late at night. No one knows what was inside, but it was weird. The whole area's been tight-lipped about it." Sam's gut twisted. He leaned forward, his hand pressing against the desk. This was it, the piece he had been waiting for. Reynolds had been meeting people in the shadows, and Sam wasn't about to let him get away with it. "I need you to find out more," Sam said, his voice tight with urgency. "Everything. Who he's meeting, where he's going. I want to know it all." "I'm on it," the informant replied before hanging up. Sam sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Every lead, every piece of information seemed to be drawing him closer to something much darker. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He wasn't just investigating a millionaire pretending to be a street sweeper. He was investigating a man with a secret, a man who had his hands in something that went beyond simple charity work or personal guilt. His thoughts drifted back to Elena. She was at the center of all of this, whether she realized it or not. Sam had watched her closely over the past week, observed the subtle shifts in her behavior, the way her eyes followed Reynolds when he was around. There was a connection there, something more than just a shared moment of kindness. Elena was a part of Reynolds' mystery, and Sam needed to understand why. He picked up his phone again and dialed her number. It rang twice before she answered, her voice weary but calm. "Detective Cooper," she said, her tone a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. "Hey, Elena. I need to talk to you about Reynolds. We're getting close to something, and I need you to trust me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sam could hear her breathing, soft and measured. "I don't know what you think you're going to find," she said finally, her voice tight. "But I can't be a part of it. I don't want to get involved in whatever this is." "Elena," Sam said, his voice firm, "I need to know everything. You've seen him. You know him better than anyone right now. What is he hiding? What's going on?" She hesitated again, and for a brief moment Sam thought she might hang up. But then, to his surprise, she spoke. "He's not what you think," she said softly. "I don't know exactly what he's up to, but he's not here just for the reasons he says. It's more complicated than that." Sam's heart rate quickened. He had known it all along. There was something deeper going on, and now Elena was confirming it. "I'm not trying to hurt him, Elena," Sam said, his tone softer now. "I'm trying to protect you. I need to know everything you can tell me. You've seen him help people, yes, but that's not the whole story, is it?" Elena was silent for a long time, and Sam could almost hear the internal struggle in her voice. Finally, she spoke again. "I don't know if I can trust you, Detective," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But I'll tell you this. He's not just trying to make up for something. He's running from something. And it's not just his past. It's bigger than that." Sam's mind was reeling. Bigger than his past? What was she talking about? "Elena, please," he urged, his voice desperate. "Tell me everything you know." "I can't," she said, a tremor in her voice. "But I think you're getting too close to something you don't understand. Stay away from Reynolds, Sam. You don't know what you're dealing with." The line went dead before Sam could respond. He stared at his phone, his thoughts spiraling. Elena had just confirmed everything he had suspected. Reynolds was more than just a man trying to hide in plain sight. He was running from something so big that even Elena couldn't bring herself to say it. Sam's gut told him that this was the beginning of something much darker. He wasn't about to back down. The truth was within reach, and Sam was going to uncover it no matter what it took. Jim's mind was racing as he walked down the familiar streets of the neighborhood, the weight of the day's events pressing on his shoulders. The conversation with Elena echoed in his head. Her warning had unsettled him, left him with more questions than answers. He had known for a while that something wasn't right. But now, with her words hanging in the air, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He had thought that by stepping into her world, by helping people, he might find redemption, something he had lost after the accident. But Elena's words had pierced through his intentions, and for the first time, Jim questioned his own motives. Was he really here to understand, or had he been hiding from the very truth that would unravel everything? The sun was beginning to set as Jim reached the corner where he and Elena had been working earlier that week. The street was quieter than usual, but Jim sensed a shift in the air. Something had changed. As he walked closer, he saw a group of people gathered around. His stomach twisted in knots. He knew something was wrong. Elena was there, standing at the center of the crowd. Her face was pale, her body stiff, and there was a tension in the air that made Jim's heart race. The group of men who had caused trouble before were back, and they weren't alone. The leader of the group, the one who had confronted Elena before, stepped forward, a sneer on his face as he saw Jim approaching. "Looks like we got ourselves a visitor," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think you can just walk in and out of here like you own the place?" Jim's pulse quickened. He had been here before, had faced down these men before, but this time it felt different. The anger in their eyes was more than just a power struggle. It was personal. They weren't going to back down. Not this time. "Elena, get back," Jim said, his voice low, his instincts kicking in. He couldn't let this escalate any further. He wasn't sure what was happening, but it was clear that the situation was about to get out of control. But Elena didn't move. Instead, she stood her ground, her eyes meeting his, a silent challenge in her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Jim. she said quietly. "I've been running for too long. We've been running for too long." The words hit Jim harder than he expected. He had thought he was here to help her, but now he realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about him too. They were both running from something, and now it had caught up with them. The leader of the group stepped closer, his face inches from Jim's. "You don't belong here," he spat. "This is our turf. You're not welcome." Jim's hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to say something, wanted to push back, but the truth was he wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. He wasn't sure if it was Elena he was trying to protect, or if it was his own shattered sense of self. "You think you can stop us?" the man growled, shoving Jim hard in the chest. "You think you can fix everything?" For a moment, Jim felt the weight of the man's words settle in his chest. Fix everything. Could he? Could he fix his own past, his own mistakes? Or was he just running, pretending to be someone he wasn't? "Elena," Jim said, his voice cracking slightly. "This isn't the way." But Elena didn't answer. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her eyes locked on the man. "We've been fighting for a long time, and we're not done yet." The man hesitated, clearly taken aback by her words. But then he grinned, his eyes narrowing. "You're just like him," he sneered, pointing at Jim. "A rich man who thinks he can fix everything with his money. Well, you can't, and neither can she." The crowd around them shifted, murmurs of agreement running through them. Jim's stomach twisted, the weight of the words sinking deeper into his chest. He wasn't just an outsider to them, he was a symbol of everything they despised. And yet Elena stood her ground. She wasn't backing down, wasn't showing fear. She was ready to fight. Jim could see it in her eyes. The same fire that had kept her going all these years, the fire that had kept him from falling apart. "Jim," she said quietly, her voice strong. "You can't fix this with money. You can't fix it with power. You have to fight. For us, for everything we've been through." The truth hit Jim like a slap to the face. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about pretending to understand, pretending to be someone else. It was about standing up, fighting for something bigger than himself. He looked at Elena, her eyes filled with a quiet strength, and he knew. This was the moment when he stopped running. He wasn't just here to help her anymore. He was here to fight for both of them. Without thinking, Jim took a step forward, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let this group of men push them around anymore. He wasn't going to let his past control his future. He wasn't going to run anymore. The tension in the air was palpable as Jim and Elena stood their ground against the group of men. The leader, still sneering, seemed to be sizing them up, clearly unconvinced by their resolve. Jim's fists clenched at his sides, but this time he wasn't afraid. He knew what was at stake. "You don't know who you're messing with," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't belong here, none of you do." Jim stood tall, the weight of the words hitting harder than he expected, but he refused to show it. He wasn't just standing up for Elena anymore. He was standing up for himself, for his right to be here, to fight for something that mattered. Before Jim could respond, Elena took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. She was done hiding, done running. She was ready to confront the very thing that had held her back for so long. "I've heard enough," Elena said, her voice sharp and resolute. "We've been running from people like you for too long, but not anymore." The man paused, his eyes narrowing in confusion. It was clear he hadn't expected Elena to fight back. Not like this, not with that kind of fire in her voice. "Go ahead," Elena continued. "Keep threatening us, keep trying to scare us, but we won't back down. Not anymore." Jim's heart swelled with a mix of admiration and relief. Elena wasn't afraid anymore. She was confronting the very people who had tried to break her, and she wasn't alone. Jim had been right to step into her world. He couldn't run anymore either. The silence between them was thick, but just as it seemed like the situation might escalate again, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from the crowd of onlookers that had gathered around them. "Hey, you can't just let them do that." Jim and Elena both turned to see a man stepping forward, pushing through the crowd. He was older, his clothes worn, but his face was determined. It was clear he wasn't one of the men from the group. He was one of the residents who lived here. someone who had witnessed the same injustices time and time again. The leader of the group snarled, "What do you want?" "I want this to stop," the man said, his voice firm. "I've had enough of you bullying people here. It's time for it to end." The man's unexpected support hung in the air for a moment, thick with possibility. Elena and Jim exchanged a glance, unsure whether this new ally was genuine or just another person hoping to stay on the good side of the men in power. But the man didn't back down. He kept his eyes fixed on the leader of the group, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't own this place," he said. "We all live here, and I'm not letting you push people around anymore. You don't get to decide who belongs." The leader of the group looked around, his face flushed with anger, but it was clear that the support of the crowd was starting to shift. The onlookers murmured among themselves, and for the first time the men who had been causing trouble seemed less certain. Jim could feel the change in the atmosphere. This wasn't just a fight between a few people anymore. It was the entire neighborhood standing up to the fear that had kept them silent for so long. "You're making a mistake," the leader spat, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. He could feel the tide turning, and he didn't like it. Elena stepped closer to Jim, her voice soft but filled with determination. "We're not backing down," she said, her eyes never leaving the group. "Not anymore." Jim looked around, seeing the faces of the people who had gathered behind them, people who had witnessed the oppression, the fear, and the silent suffering. These weren't just bystanders. These were people who had lived through the same struggles, the same hardships, and now they were ready to fight back. The leader hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd. For the first time he seemed unsure, his posture stiffening as he looked at the support growing around Jim and Elena. Without a word, he turned and walked away, followed by the others. They didn't want to risk escalating things further, not when they were no longer the only ones in control. As the men retreated, the crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, their posture easing as the tension dissipated. Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline wore off. Jim looked at her, his heart still racing, but a sense of pride filled him. They had done it. Together they had stood up to the bullies and won. The man who had spoken out stepped closer, a small, proud smile on his face. "You did good," he said, nodding to both Jim and Elena. "We don't get a lot of outsiders standing up for us. But it's nice to see that there are people who still care." Elena's eyes softened. "Thank you for stepping in." The man shrugged. "It's nothing. We all need to look out for each other." Jim felt the weight of the moment sink in. For the first time, he wasn't just a stranger in this neighborhood. He was part of it, fighting for something real, something that mattered. "Looks like we're allies now," Jim said, offering a small smile to Elena. Elena's eyes met his, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had fought together, not as strangers but as allies, and in this moment, it felt like a new beginning. The air was thick with tension as Jim and Elena stood at the edge of the warehouse district. The distant hum of traffic was drowned out by the sound of their quick breaths, both knowing that the moment had arrived. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the looming confrontation ahead. Jim had never felt this way before. Every part of him screamed to run, to hide, to leave the truth buried where it had been for so long. But the longer he stood here, the more he realized that this was the moment he could no longer avoid. This wasn't just about him and Elena anymore. This was about everything he had been running from for years. "Are you sure about this?" Elena's voice broke the silence. She was standing a little apart from him, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her posture was resolute, but Jim could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Jim nodded slowly. "I'm as sure as I can be. We can't keep pretending this is something we can control from the sidelines. We have to face it head on." Elena met his gaze, her face hardening. "Then let's make it count." They approached the warehouse, the place where it all began. The night they had come here before, the shadows had hidden everything. But now, under the harsh light of the street lamps, everything was laid bare. The people Jim had been chasing, the secrets he had been trying to avoid. They were all connected to this place. Suddenly, the door of the warehouse creaked open, and the leader of the group of men Jim and Elena had faced earlier stepped out. His presence was commanding, and Jim could feel the air grow colder as he locked eyes with him. "You've come to the wrong place," the man said, his voice low, almost mocking. "I warned you to stay out of this. Now you're just making things worse for yourself." Jim felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but it wasn't fear this time. It was clarity. The fear had drained out of him in the days leading up to this moment, replaced by a new, unnerving sense of certainty. He couldn't walk away now, not after everything. He had to face the man in front of him, face the things he had avoided. "You were right," Jim said, his voice steady. "But it's too late for that now. You've made this personal." The man's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the handle of a knife tucked into his jacket. "Personal? You're the one who walked into my world. You don't get to just waltz in and think you can change things." Elena stepped forward, standing beside Jim. "You're wrong. You've been controlling this place with fear, but that ends today." The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think you've got what it takes to stop me? You're just like everyone else. Think you're different? Think you matter?" Jim's chest tightened as he stared down the man. "I don't care about being different. I care about stopping people like you from tearing everything down. The only thing that matters now is ending this, today." There was a pause, a silence that hung heavy between them, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then the man's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. "You have no idea what you're up against," the man said, stepping closer, his hand still resting on the knife. Jim squared his shoulders, matching his every movement. "I know more than you think." The man's face twisted into a snarl as he lunged forward, the knife flashing in the dim light. But Jim was ready. Without hesitation, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it hard enough to make him drop the knife with a sharp clatter against the concrete. The man staggered back, shocked by Jim's strength. Elena was right beside him now, standing tall, no longer just a bystander. She had seen it all before, the intimidation, the fear, but now she was as determined as Jim to put an end to this cycle of violence. Together, they had become a force the man hadn't prepared for. "You don't run this place anymore," Elena said, her voice calm but deadly. "This ends now." The man, breathing heavily, backed away, his hands raised in mock surrender. But Jim could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. This wasn't the easy victory he had expected. They had pushed him to the edge. "I'm not going to let you destroy what little's left here," Jim said, his voice filled with cold certainty. "Not anymore." For a moment, the man stood there as if weighing his options. But then he turned, his face dark with rage. Without a word, he disappeared into the shadows of the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Jim and Elena stood still, the weight of the moment settling over them. They had done it. They had faced the darkness together, and they had won. But the victory felt hollow, incomplete. There was still so much left unsaid, so much left to face. "Is it really over?" Elena asked, her voice quiet, her eyes still searching the darkness for any sign of the man's return. Jim looked at her, his chest tight with unspoken emotions. "I don't know, but we've taken the first step." The silence between them was heavy, but it was the kind of silence that came after a battle. They had faced the enemy together, and they had won, but there was still so much more to confront, still so much left to uncover. But for the first time, Jim felt a flicker of hope. They had made it through this, and together they could face whatever came next. Days had passed since the confrontation with the men at the warehouse, but for Jim, the aftermath was far from over. The adrenaline of the moment had worn off, leaving behind a quiet emptiness. He had done what needed to be done, had fought when it mattered most. But now, as he stood in the aftermath, he felt a weight that he hadn't anticipated. Elena was nearby, quietly sorting through a few things, the weight of everything they had been through still lingering between them. The silence was different now. It wasn't the awkward silence from before. This was the silence of two people processing everything, trying to figure out where they stood after the storm had passed. Jim had always been good at putting on a mask, at pretending to be someone he wasn't. But now, with everything stripped away, With the facade gone, he found himself wondering who he really was. He wasn't just the CEO of a tech company anymore. He wasn't the man who had been hiding behind his wealth. He wasn't even the street sweeper who had come to understand something about the world through a different lens. He was just a man, still broken, still scarred, but maybe, just maybe, starting to heal. "You're quiet today." Elena's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She was studying him, trying to gauge how he was feeling, if he was even okay. Jim forced a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just thinking, I guess." "About what?" "I don't know," Jim said, shaking his head slightly. "Everything. The fight, the people, the things I've done. I don't know how to fix all of it, or if I even can." Elena stepped forward, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "You don't have to fix everything, Jim. You just have to start somewhere." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. They were the same words that had echoed in his mind when he first came to this neighborhood. Start somewhere, start small. But now, they carried more weight. They weren't just a call to action, they were a reminder that healing didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a grand gesture, a big fix. It was a process, a small step, a breath, a decision to move forward even when the past was so hard to leave behind. Jim took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle in. The truth was, he wasn't sure where to start, but for the first time he was ready to try. "I guess I've been running for so long," Jim admitted, his voice quieter now, "and I don't know how to stop." Elena walked closer, her presence steady, grounding. "You stop by standing still for a moment. You stop by accepting that it's okay to feel lost. You don't need to have all the answers." Jim nodded, feeling the tightness in his chest loosen just a fraction. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't have to fix everything. Maybe healing didn't require some grand, dramatic gesture. Maybe it just meant being real, being honest with himself, with her, and with the world around him. "I want to help," Jim said, his voice steady now. "I want to do more than just show up and fight. I want to help make things better here, where it matters." Elena didn't say anything at first. She just stood there watching him, her face softening. Then, after a long beat, she gave him a small nod. "You can," she said simply. "But first, you have to believe that you're worth helping." Jim felt something shift in him at her words. It wasn't an answer, and it certainly wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. It was the start of something real. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that it was possible. That he could change, that they could change, that they could start something new together. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences hanging in the air. But this time, it felt lighter. There was a quiet understanding between them now, something that hadn't been there before. "I don't know how this ends, Elena," Jim said, his voice low but sure. "But I want to find out with you. I want to keep fighting." Elena's eyes met his, and this time, there was no hesitation, no doubt, just the simple truth of two people who had been through the fire and had come out the other side, scarred but stronger. "Then let's fight," she said softly, her voice full of resolve. "Together." The weight of the moment settled over them, not as a burden, but as a quiet strength. Jim realized in that moment that healing wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about moving forward step by step and facing whatever came next with someone by his side. And for the first time in a long time, Jim wasn't afraid. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as Jim and Elena walked side by side. The air felt different today, less heavy, more hopeful. There was a subtle shift in everything around them. The tension that had once loomed over their every step had begun to dissipate, replaced by the quiet hum of something new taking root. Jim had never imagined this kind of peace. The chaos, the fear, the self-doubt that had consumed him for so long now seemed distant, like a bad dream he was finally waking up from. He wasn't fully healed. There were still scars, still moments when the weight of his past threatened to pull him back. But for the first time, He understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward, one step at a time. "You know," Elena said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never thought I'd see the day when you actually showed up to help us." Jim chuckled softly, glancing over at her. "Yeah, well, I didn't think I'd be here either. But somehow here we are." Elena smiled, though there was still a flicker of something in her eyes. Something deeper, something that spoke to the battles they had both fought, together and alone. The time for pretense was over. They had both seen the ugliness of the world, the struggles and the betrayals, but they had also seen the possibility for change, for something better. "I never thought you'd come around," she said quietly, "but I'm glad you did." Jim didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to explain everything that had shifted inside him. How could he? He wasn't the same man who had walked into this neighborhood, hiding behind his wealth and his status. He had faced too much, learned too much to be that person anymore. Instead, he just nodded, his gaze focused ahead. There was so much he still didn't understand, so much left to work through. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone anymore. They reached the corner of the street, where a small group of people had gathered. It was the same group of residents who had once watched from the sidelines, unsure of whether to step up. But now, they were different. Now, they were standing together, ready to take control of their future. Jim stopped for a moment, glancing at Elena, a silent question in his eyes. She looked back at him, and in that brief exchange, they both knew what they had to do. This wasn't just about fighting the past anymore. It was about creating something new, something lasting. Elena stepped forward first, her voice steady as she spoke to the group. "We fought for too long," she said, her words carrying through the gathering crowd. "But now, we fight for each other. We build something better, for ourselves, for our future." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces lighting up with a new sense of purpose. Jim stood quietly beside Elena, watching as the people around him began to stand a little taller, their shoulders straightening, their confidence growing. This wasn't just about overcoming the past. It was about taking back control, about making their own choices for the first time. Jim stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "I've learned a lot in the past few weeks," he began. "I've learned that it's not about what you have, but about who you choose to stand with. And I'm choosing to stand with all of you." The crowd's energy shifted again, the weight of their shared struggles transforming into something positive, something stronger. They weren't just standing together, they were united. For the first time in his life, Jim felt like he was part of something real, something that mattered. He wasn't just the outsider anymore, the wealthy man pretending to understand. He was a part of this community, this fight, this chance at a new beginning. "I'm not the same man who walked in here," Jim continued, his voice gaining strength. "And I'll never go back to that. I found a place here with all of you, and I'll help however I can." The crowd cheered, a wave of energy flowing through them. Elena stood beside Jim, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and relief. They had done it. They had fought for this moment together, and they had won. Jim took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was just the beginning, he knew. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, more moments of doubt. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his place, his purpose, and for the first time, he was ready to face whatever came next. Elena turned to him, her smile soft but knowing. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jim smiled back, his heart light. "Yeah, but I think we've still got a long way to go." And for the first time in a long time, Jim was ready to walk that road. What do you think of Jim's actions? Was his decision to face his past the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, what's your score for this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss one of our stories. And for more heartwarming tales, click here on the end screen.